Now, last week on Talk Africa, we unpacked the roots of the global financial system and heard why, for many African countries, the system has failed to deliver on its promise of growth and stability.
We looked at how institutions like the IMF and World Bank were created without Africa in mind and why decades of reform calls have brought so little change.
Now, this week, we turn our focus to the future. If the current system does not work for Africa, what are the alternatives and who is building them? From new regional financial institutions to the launch of the African Credit Rating Agency, African-led solutions are taking shape.
But first, let's take a moment to hear what some of our panelists had to say last week.
First of all, the time these institutions were formed, what are popularly referred to as the Bretton Woods institutions, they were formed when the West was largely colonizing and seeking to colonize Africa. So in their mindset and in their thinking and infrastructure, their approach to Africa is about extraction.
Africa needs to generate revenue, enough of exporting raw materials and commodities. Because when we export raw, we don't add value and we leave value on the table. So we need to increase our revenue base. If we don't increase our revenue base, you know that 3% we contribute to the global economy?
Right.
3% is not a lot of power. So until we increase that for ourselves, we cannot get as much voice and power in the global economy. And lastly, we also need to link our investments. When we borrow our money, we need to link it to investments that yield over time. So they need to have returns such as roads, energy, power, education, healthcare. We can find out that when you invest in these sectors, over time you get a return for your investment.
IMF, the World Bank, don't just go to these countries. These countries actually approach them. And they write very elaborate proposals in their notes on here is what we're committing to in order to unlock this level of funding. This is where we're going to spend it.
We'll also look beyond Africa to South-South cooperation and BRICS and ask whether the Global South can reshape global finance on its own terms.
And at the heart of all this is leadership, because even the best systems need visionary leaders to steer them. So what kind of leadership does Africa need to truly achieve financial sovereignty?
Welcome to the second part of this special episode of Talk Africa, co-produced with TV47 on the global financial system. I'm Hibak Said from TV47.
And I'm Beatrice Marshall from CGTN. This week on the program, we explore African alternatives, South-South solidarity, and the leadership it will take to build a new financial future.
We have a lot to discuss, so let's dive straight into our panel. Here with us in studio, James Shikwati, who is the founder of the Inter-Region Economic Network, and Churchill Ogutu, an economist of IC Group.
And joining us from New York via Zoom, Dr. Meshach Mutize, lead expert on support to African countries on credit ratings agencies. And also joining us from Beijing via Zoom, Professor John Gong, professor at the University of International Business and Economics. And here with us, we also have an audience of experts from the African Development Think Tank and students from the University of Nairobi participating in this discussion today. Thank you all very much for joining us in this discussion. Let me start off with you, Professor John Gong, because we're talking about alternatives for Africa when it comes to seeking financial solutions. Financial sovereignty for African countries has really become a critical issue, particularly with the changing global order. In your view, what steps can the continent take to reduce reliance on Western financial institutions like the Bretton Woods and find alternative financial solutions?
Well, let me first start by briefly summarizing the new landscape we're faced with right now. That is mostly related to the policy, the trade policy, the monetary policy emanating from Washington. I think what President Trump is doing is essentially to upend what's called the rules-based international order, at least in the trade area, in the economics area. I think President Trump wants to replace it with a sort of a U.S.-centric a set of bilateral relationships between the United States and every other country, and on his terms, of course. I think what it means is that many countries, as we've already seen, are going to be faced with a much higher tariffs for those countries that have a major trade relationship with the United States. And the consequence of that is that it's getting, the foreign exchange reserves is going to be diminished as a result of more difficulties associated with exports to the United States, particularly those countries in the developing world, especially I think in Africa. Even those countries, these are the set of poorest countries in the world that used to enjoy a zero tariff status with the United States as part of the AGOA agreement, now is facing a totally different reality. This is going to be out of the window. So I think from that perspective, I think a lot of countries' foreign exchange, the exchange ratio is going to be under immense pressure. And I think the solution for that is moving towards a multi-currency world,
right.
which has already started, and I think it's going to be accelerating right now. And I think that's probably the solution that I have in mind for a lot of countries in Africa.
So, Dr. Mutize, I want to get your view because there are now quite a few alternatives for the global South, unlike 60 years ago. So, from where you sit, though, what steps can the continent take to reduce dependence on Western financial institutions?
It's the reason why we are here in New York to advance the need for reform in the global financial architecture. And we did the same also in Washington during the spring meetings. And to me personally, I think that the discourse is ripe that there is need for change in the global setup. And I'm sure in the preceding discussion, there was a highlight on why this is a legitimate call for that to happen. But maybe the big question is there willingness for that transformation to happen, for that architecture to rechange, to be reshaped? Because if you engage with the institutions that are at the center of driving this global financial setup, they seem to be a little bit resistant for that to happen, in as much as there is a broader need, which is undeniable and legitimate, that there is need for this change, but there seems to be some resistance, even when the provisions for that change is clear before us.
Right.
All right, let me throw it to you, James. Let's talk about homegrown solutions. We do have African-led institutions such as the Africa Development Bank and many others that are coming up. Maybe tell us some of those institutions that are going to help us get out of this challenge so that we're not as reliant to foreign-led institutions.
Yeah, I'd like to put it in historical context, first of all, that trade in Africa, financing in Africa did not start with the Bretton Woods. Africans were trading before. They had ways of paying for the goods, whether it was the trade routes in the West Africa or the Swahili trade routes here in the East African region and Southern Africa region. One key component that used to drive that kind of trade was trust. Trusting that the good will be delivered and it will be paid for. But historically, when Africa, of course, engaged with other countries, slave trade became internationalized. And then, of course, if you recall, ivory trade as well. And in the process, the trust levels went down because each community now was suspecting that the slavers will be using the other community to come and raid them. And as we speak, Africa suffers a huge trust deficit. And that's part of the reason why the 54 nation states, even when they meet and negotiate and agree and sign on to paper, that traumatic memory of the past keeps coming back. And then you get trust levels going down, whether it's in the East Africa region or in the West Africa region. So I think the first thing to deploy is the diplomatic channels within these 54 nation states to build trust because without trust, the rest you can write, you can launch, and nothing happens. Then, of course, second, as we push the diplomatic channels, then we go to the Africa multilateral financial systems, as you've mentioned, the Afrexim Bank, the Africa Development Bank, and other institutions that Africa Union has been putting in place so that we actualize. But to actualize, trust is needed. And to get trust, we need to go back to our political leaders. The biggest challenge we have, our political leaders are in survival mode. They want to win elections, and they keep making promises, and they want to deliver on what they cannot deliver. So there's a lot of rethinking that is needed internally, even as we think about the externality of our financial challenges.
Right, so let me come back to you, Dr. Mutize, because your sentiments are that there is resistance from the IMF or other global institutions for Africa to chart its own path. But I want to find out from you, where exactly then are Africa-led efforts to do this for themselves?
One of the issues that come to mind is the bilateral arrangements that our member states have in some countries or some institutions outside the continent. So I tell you the complexity of this because I've been in the African Union system for some time, and we have tried to incubate this project on the Africa Credit Rating Agency, which came out of the decisions of heads of state and government that we need this institution. But when we develop the framework then, that this is the framework that we are recommending so that this institution can come to fruition and achieve the purpose that we want to establish for. It took us about 5 years for that to happen, just to go through the policy organs of the African Union. When you have a heads of state decision that we need this institution, so for you to go through the policy organs, for that to be accepted, so that you can put the framework together, it took us so long like that, because each of the member states has got its own interest based on the bilateral relations that it has. We had some of the member states actually pointing that we don't need an Africa Credit Rating Agency. It has the same fate also that has suffered the three multilateral institutions of the African Union, the African Central Bank, the Investment Bank, and the Monetary Fund, because the member states are just not ratifying to the protocols. So you find this complexity is that some people have chosen to call that it's a spaghetti bowl, because you've got so many interests that are intertwined that people are not willing to entangle from. But thank God that we have at some point come to the intersection of interest, and those that might not find it useful at this point have accepted that we need that policy position. Right. Whether this institution becomes as strong as we want it to be or not, but let's start it in the first place, which we think is very important. To start the institutions in the first place, and then you see how far it can go. And in our view, I think it will be possible to get the consensus to support such institutions in the future. Because if that is not available, if that is not done, you find that the current setup is in the best interest, and that's in the best interest of those who establish it, and that's why they are being weaponized to drive the agendas of what my colleague have just mentioned earlier, that they want to advance their interests from where they sit, not where Africa want to be.
Right. All right, Churchill, let's talk about regional integration a little bit. We do see that there is the need to scale up African-led solutions, and financial institutions need some help. What are some of the things you can do to speed this up?
A number of issues needs to be in place, at least to ensure this integration within the financial institution is quite done in a speedy manner. The macroeconomic environment needs to be quite stable. I've seen some volatile periods of inflation, And also some of them are quite external factors coming into play, things such as drought and famine. I mean, this region is quite prevalent, these spikes in weather patterns, and they tend to bring some of this instability within the macroeconomic environment. So that has to be in place. And also speaking even to the political environment, we need to ensure that there's that stability. Yes, there's an argument that needs to be made that there's some heterogeneity within the African continent. We can't slap like all countries needs to be a democracy. That can't be the case because of just recognizing the different cultures within the continent. But that notwithstanding, there needs to be some form of some stability. So those are the underpinning factors that needs to be put in place. But fundamentally, what now needs to drive the financial inclusion, the integration, there's now the financial architecture also needs to be quite robust. And I'm speaking about issues such as the banking system. Well, we find that it's still some parts of the continent are quite advanced within the banking system, this whole financial system. Others are now trying to bring about financial inclusion with the mobile money. So it's growing gradually, but still this we still aren't at par in terms of advancing the financial systems. And also the non-bank financial institutions needs also to come along, things such as credit unions, SACCOs and all that. So at least to be able to build this whole financial system. The other bit around that is at least you've seen some progress around the payments and settlement services. On a regional basis, we also have the country level and also regional level. For instance, this part of the continent, we have the East African payment solutions, and also taking it a step further, we have what is the Pan-African payment and settlement services. So that ensures that if you are trading even within the continent, one part of the continent with the other part of the continent, it ensures that there's that seamless payment settlement. So I think those, if are harnessed, it will now be able to be a fertile ground even for financial inclusion and also for the multilateral development partners to be able to take it a step further.
So Professor John Gong, I want to get your insights really in terms of boosting intra-Africa trade, particularly with the creation of the Africa CFTA, Continental Free Trade Area, and learning from some lessons from groupings in the Far East, for instance. How do you see that happening if Africa is to become self-sufficient and for the Africa CFTA to get its full potential?
Yeah, well, I actually published a paper in this regard in a journal called The World Economy. One of our findings is that there's actually a lack of infrastructure related to intra-Africa trade. For example, and let me give you an example. We're talking about the trade between, let's say, Malawi and Congo, right? They are neighboring countries, but it's so difficult. There's not much of a highway that can link the two countries very easily. You have to go through, very difficult sea routes to go to the other end of the African continent. This is the one example I'm talking about. Other than hard infrastructure, there's also a lack of what we describe as soft-based infrastructure to support intra-Africa trade. Exactly the things we're talking about. The payment system, the settlement system, the customs clearing system, and all these sort of the supporting services associated with trade. The long way to go to develop these things. Regional economic integration is always good. I think a lot has to be done in that regard to facilitate intra-regional trade, among African countries.
And maybe, James, when it comes to financial integration and even having the same trade policies, we do see that there might be challenges in that sector. How can harmonizing trade policies and even developing a shared financial market strengthen Africa's economic resilience?
Well, we can use East Africa Community as an example because it's actually aspiring to have a common currency in East Africa, and in East Africa there's been an attempt to have free movement of goods. I say an attempt because countries still slap duties against each other on eggs and milk. But I think the starting point is growing the local market, because when you grow the local market, when people start trading, then it makes it easier for you to talk about the next step, that we can have a common currency. But as it's been pointed out earlier, example Malawi and Democratic Republic of Congo, if there's no connection at all, even if we had a payment system, it won't add much value because people are not really transacting. So I think there's infrastructure aspect, and there's the point of having deliberate effort to build the local market, not just having a policy aspect. And the biggest challenge for me really is the execution. Because if we visit all these regional economic blocks in Africa, they have very good plans, very good strategies, but then they are somewhere on the shelf. So getting them executed, getting them to be implemented, I think that's the biggest challenge, which I highly doubt that African Union can take that mandate to execute, but it's easier to start at regional level because people are closer to the region. They have traded before historically, so they are not coming together courtesy of matters of policy. Then secondly, is to try and follow what the private sector is doing. You'll notice in East Africa, again, as an example, there'll be Kenyan companies investing outside of Kenya. For example, banks in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Uganda, there'll be retail stores in Tanzania. So if we follow the footprints, we've seen even Nigerian banks in East Africa, we follow the footprints of these pioneers, the private sector, and then ride on that to build an infrastructure that can then give us a financial system that works for us.
Right. So, Dr. Mutize, I want to come back to you on these African-led efforts. And we talked about the African Credit Rating Agency launched in January by the African Union. What impact will this have, though, on investor confidence and borrowing costs for the continent? Because we know that Africa is often seen by the Bretton Woods as a risky investment destination.
Having an agenda to establish an Africa Credit Rating Agency is to, number one, educate the market that provide funding that Africa is not as risky as you perceive. Mm-hmm. So when you educate the market, because remember, the market, the financial market trade opinions and they trade perception, and that is driven by the perception of risk. And that perception of risk is normally ignited by institutions that are perceived to be credible, providing information to market participants. So we are bringing this institution as part of the broader ecosystem of financing to be used as a benchmark, even by the big three rating agencies whom investors solely depend on for credibility, as a benchmark to provide more comprehensive information that might be lying under the radar of the big three rating agencies, which drives the perception because of many other factors, including one which has been highlighted many times, that they are not operating from Africa, so they don't understand the context of Africa.
Let's now get a comment from Duncan. Duncan is from the African Development Think Tank. Duncan?
I think I concur with the speakers of their concerns and sentiments before me. The only question we need to ask ourselves from an African perspective is it possible to increase liquidity without increasing borrowing? And a number of measures come to mind. When you look at one of the instruments like SDR, if the allocations of SDR to these less developed countries are increased, in the interim, even as African countries try to look at different alternatives, that could be one of the areas that can also be considered. Secondly, there are also some trust issues that needs to be looked at if Africa were to trade with itself. Because you ask ourselves, even if Africa were to continue exporting raw materials to the outside world, these raw materials go to develop those outside world more than the originating country. Case in point, if you look at the EPZ case in Kenya, where we export clothes, these clothes find their way back in the form of mutumba many years after. So there are a lot of basic structural things that we need to sort out as Africa, even before we were to look at alternatives. Because even if we have to go to other alternatives, if we don't address the systemic challenges that we are trying to run away from these developed, these Bretton Woods institutions and other lenders, we would find ourselves in the same spot. So there's still some work to be done, even at internal, regional level, because we are not at the same level of development. Thank you.
All right, very interesting discussion. We will continue in a moment, but for now, we will now take a short break, and when we come back, we'll explore what South-South cooperation could mean for Africa's financial future, what kind of leadership is needed to drive a real change, and how the global South can shape a system that works for all. To stay with us.